All right, you guys, we are going to start with a review of the Reformation so that hopefully it'll bring together some of the stuff you've been hearing in the movie about Luther, as well as some of the information that you read in your AMSCO. And so we'll do that first, talk about the Reformation, and then we'll move on to specifically talking about the English Reformation, which has some foundation in some religious changes, but mostly is a political change. So, the Reformation of the 16th century or 1500s, I love this quote because I think it really speaks to what was going on and why a lot of people felt there needed to be a change. And this is by R.H. Benton. And it says, thus, the papacy emerged as something between an Italian city-state and European power, without forgetting at the same time the claim to be the vice-regent of Christ. The Pope often could not make up his mind whether he was the successor of Peter or of Caesar. Such vacillation had much to do with the rise and success of the Protestant Reformation. So that idea that the church had attempted to move into the political realm and to really assert its power and authority over areas in Italy, and then also trying to dabble in the politics of France and England and the Holy Roman Empire, had made it an enemy of not just the political leaders of Europe, but because they were doing that, there became this sense that the church wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, which was to be like a representation of Christ to the people of Europe. So it stopped focusing on taking care of the poor and teaching the people about Jesus, and started focusing more on politics. And so you have people like Luther and Calvin who want to reform the Catholic Church and change it because it has lost its religious authority and has become more of a political authority. And then you have the political authorities like the kings of different areas that are like also frustrated that the church has become too powerful and is trying to interrupt their rule. So you start to have people within the church that are upset about it, and then also on the outside of the church with the political leaders. And that is a perfect storm for having the Catholic Church start to, it doesn't disintegrate during this time period, and it actually doesn't lose as many followers as you would think initially, but it starts to fragment and break up into smaller sections, and the Catholic Church starts to lose its power. So I love this political cartoon. It was created by Martin Luther in 1545, and it was a caricature of Pope Alexander VI, and he was considered to be one of the most corrupt of the Borgia popes. And he was known for something called the Banquet of the Chestnuts, which is where cardinals from all around gathered, and there were prostitutes involved, and there was a lot of bad behavior. And it happened right in the area. It wasn't hidden. It was one of these things where it was kind of obvious that it was happening. And so for people during this time period, it just seemed to represent how corrupt the church had become and how it lacked any kind of moral character. And if you see in this, the way that you tell that it's the Pope is because it has the crown that has 3 tiers. And that's going to be really helpful when you're analyzing political cartoons in the future. If you see a 3-tiered crown, that represents the Pope and the Catholic Church. And then on it in Latin, it says, Ego sum papa, which means I am your father. So maybe a nice reference to the future Star Wars, right? A little foreshadowing. But this idea that this very disgusting and corrupt looking, almost devil-like person is the Pope or the Papa or your father. So that was what Martin Luther was kind of pointing at and saying, this is where the church has gone, and that's why it needs reform. This is in 1545, so this is after a lot of the pressure Martin Luther had already been kicked out of the Catholic Church, and so he felt kind of free to go ahead and do this kind of political cartoon. Okay, I'm going to go through this slide really quickly because these are things that would have been in your reading and you should know already. But the causes of the Reformation would be the corruption of the Catholic Church, and that can be seen in the selling of indulgences. It could also be seen in the fact that you had priests that had many parishes and was collecting tithes or money from lots of different churches and then not actually performing their duties. Another cause long term is the Avignon papacy, and that's when, again, the church moved from Rome to France. And at that point, they were also very corrupt. They were collecting money. They were under the control of the French. And so a lot of people started to think, well, is the Pope the representative of Christ, or is he the representative of the French? And then once you have the Great Schism, and you have three popes at one time, then it really becomes clear that no longer probably is God picking the Pope, but political leaders are determining who is Pope. There's the council, we call it conciliarism, or the approach that they tried to take when the Pope was not leading the way they thought he should, is they set up councils and they made proclamations or determinations about what the Catholic Church should believe and what the people should believe. And a lot of times these councils added things that were maybe not in Scripture to the beliefs of the Catholic Church. And that's where the indulgences come from, and that's where Martin Luther started to see these councils as being something that was making decisions that people just needed to look to Scripture to find the answer to, instead of looking to these religious leaders. Additionally, you have the development of personal devotions of people who felt like they could connect with God without having to go to church or go to Mass or have a clergy person present. And that a lot had to do with the fact that they did not feel like the church and the clergy were actually truly representing Christ anymore. They were corrupt, they were in it for the money, and so there was that development. Additionally, you have the greed of the secular leaders. The Catholic Church owned a third of the land in Europe, and so you have kings that are starting to look very thirstily on the church's land and resources and think, I would like to take this for myself. And so that's going to also help to lead to the Reformation. The church needing more money and kind of being in a weakened position in the 15th century and into the 16th century is going to lead them to selling those indulgences, which is going to, again, show the increasing corruptness of the church, and the use of the money is not for the helping the people, but is usually for either paying off debts from previous popes who spent extravagantly on themselves, or in the case of the one indulgence that Luther was really fighting against, it was being sold to help to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is gorgeous. And you have Michelangelo involved he was the architect of it. And it's where the Pieta is. And it's just a gorgeous place. But again, necessary in a time of economic stress. And should people be paying for it, thinking that they're getting out of their time in purgatory by paying for it? Probably not. And so that was one of the issues. And then additionally, the reason the Reformation was able to spread and the ideas were able to get around so much, specifically in the Holy Roman Empire, was because of the prevalence of the printing press. So people who disagreed with the church, and because it was an ununified area that didn't have one strong leader. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire is kind of a mess. People were able to print what they wanted and spread it throughout Europe. And a lot of times they would write in the vernacular, which was accessible to a lot more people. And that very much made the church mad, because here people were finding out information about what they were doing that had been previously hidden. So this is a map that the College Board likes to put on tests, and you can see here the spread of the printing press and where most of the printing presses were. And usually what they want you to see is that places that were very strongly Catholic, like Spain and even France and even Italy, had very few printing presses. And in the Holy Roman Empire, they have tons of them. And so you can see that this is where the Reformation started. And this is the area that will become Protestant for the most part. The southern part of the Holy Roman Empire near Munich, you can see that the printing presses start to kind of disappear. And as you go farther south, you only have a couple. And the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire will stay very Catholic and is to this day. In fact, I just traveled there, was it 2 years ago? And we were there in Munich on a Sunday, and everything's shut. It's nothing, no businesses are allowed to be open except for restaurants. And so we couldn't get in to buy our Bayern Munich soccer or football jersey. So anyway, it's still very Catholic in the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is kind of trying to indicate to you that as the printing press spread, you have more and more people that are having access to Protestant ideas, and as a result, leaving the Catholic Church. So I mentioned this already, but the reason that Germany became kind of the hotbed for the Protestant Reformation, you can see here all the church lands that were in this area and controlled by the church, and how secular leaders might have wanted to have access and control over those lands. So it's kind of that light color that's in there. You can see it around here. I'll hover over. You can see it around Frankfurt here. This is all church land in the Holy Roman Empire. And then you have competing larger groups of families like the Habsburgs. You have the Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. Habsburgs were Charles V's family. But you have a lot of that. And then you also have free imperial cities that could kind of do what they wanted. So you have a combination of a lot of printing presses. You have church lands that a lot of local leaders would want control over. And then you have a lot of free cities that are allowed to kind of do what they want. And so it's a perfect scenario for new ideas to spread. Additionally, the Catholic Church would have a really hard time stomping out new ideas because of the lack of control they have over these small regions. So then you have Luther that slides in, and Luther comes up with two main ideas that you need to know well. And the first one is sola scriptura, which is scripture alone. And the second one is sola fide, which is faith alone. So he believed that the only point that you should reference is scripture, that you shouldn't actually be looking at what the council documents of the Catholic Church or papal bulls that the Catholic Church would put out, but that you should just look to scripture for what you should believe. And faith alone, meaning only your faith and your belief in God will save you. And so there's no way of buying indulgences or anything like that. And then you can see on this map that Wittenberg is where it starts, it all starts. And so you see the darker green being the strength of Lutheranism as it goes out. So, and then it gets lighter and lighter. So you can still see the Ottoman Empire would be Islamic. And then the yellow would be either the Catholic Church if you're talking about Spain, or you can see up there in Ireland or in Italy in the southern part of Germany. Or if you go all the way over into Russia, you're talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. So Lutheranism does spread. It spreads up into Sweden. It becomes very popular, and into Poland, but not as strong because you still have a lot of Catholics in that area. So one of the effects of the Reformation, it's always very important and comes up oftentimes on the AP test, is that some people interpreted Lutherans' ideas to not just be an argument against the Catholic Church, but an argument against hierarchy and the authority of the nobles over the average person. So if the average person had access to God, and the average person through their own reading and their own faith could go to heaven, there was something of an equality that they felt like Luther was preaching in the church. And they thought, well, shouldn't we be equal in politics and society as well? And so in 1525, after, again, he posted his 95 Theses in 1517, October 31st. So in 1525, there's something we call it the peasant revolt. It's not that peasant hadn't revolted many times, so whenever you see it, you got to look for the date. But in 1525, a lot of people rebelled because they believed that they were fulfilling Luther's ideas. And so in the movie, the Luther movie that you watched, you saw that rebellion. And what ended up happening is Luther came out and he's like, I never told peasants to rebel. And he took the side of the princes and the knights and supported them in their pretty brutal put down of this rebellion that resulted in, they think, about 200,000 peasants being killed. So there, in 1530, there's something called the Diet of Augsburg. Diet meaning a meeting in Augsburg, which is a place in Germany. And Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, he's the King of Spain as well as controls the New World, the Spanish portion of the New World. He went to this meeting, he presided over it, and he brought all the kings, or not, they're not really kings, we called them princes of the Holy Roman Empire together. And he said, some of you have been embracing Protestantism, some of you are Catholics. And he ordered all the princes to bow their knees and to return to the Catholic faith. And you see this at the very end of the Luther movie. And the emperor orders all Protestants to return to Catholicism. The result of that is that in 1531, the Lutheran princes in the Holy Roman Empire go ahead and create their own league, and they call it the Schmalkaldic League. And they form it to defend their interests, and the result is wars. So there's going to be on and off religious wars that will occur from around 1530s all the way to 1555 in the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to get into that in just a second. We need to talk about another religious figure that emerges during this time period and another type of Protestant faith that is developed, and how you just need to understand just none of them got along. So the next religious leader who makes some changes to the Catholic doctrine and eventually pulls away from the Catholic Church calls himself John Calvin, and they're called Calvinists. And his beliefs are, he promotes similar things to Luther, but he also adds in this idea of predestination, or the fact that you can't earn your way to heaven through works, but that you have already been chosen. And so that's one issue that's very different from Luther. The other thing is Calvinists really believed that they needed a governmental structure, and that they had their own laws and their own enforcement, and they really set up what we would call a state within a state. Meaning, if you were Calvinist in France or Calvinist and you were in somebody's country, the Calvinists deferred to their leader of their church, oftentimes more than they deferred to the local political leader. And so Calvinism was even more offensive to political leaders in the areas of Europe because they felt like it was threatening their own rule. Lutherans, a lot of the local leaders in the Holy Roman Empire actually embraced them because they deferred to, just like Luther did, they deferred to the nobility and to the princes. So they still understood, like, proper, at least from the European perspective at the time, proper hierarchy, like of who's in charge. Whereas the Calvinists, they set up kind of a whole new system. They had their own laws. They had their own kind of court type system. And so no one wanted them in their country because they didn't want to have a rival authority. And so most of the Calvinists then fled to Switzerland, and they set up their own, pretty much their own city-state in Geneva. And they ran it as a Calvinist would, in that they had their own rules. And if you weren't Calvinist, they would kill you. So they were no more tolerant than the Catholics were, who put you in front of the Inquisition and killed you. And the Lutherans would also kill Calvinists. So nobody's getting along at this point. By the 1500s, so late 1500s, this is what France looks like. France was a very strong Catholic country, and all of a sudden you've got this spread all over the place in France of churches popping up. Lutheran churches, Calvinist churches. The most part, just so you know, France is Calvinist. There might be Lutherans every once in a while, but it would be rare. So France is known for the Protestant faith of Calvinism, or to be Catholic. And so there was a problem because, just like I told you, the French kings felt like the Calvinists were going against their authority. And so there's going to be religious wars within France as well. It should have come up in your reading, but the most famous one is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It's not really a war when one side doesn't fight and just gets massacred, but it's one of those big events that everybody remembers. It happened in 1572, and it started as a massacre at a wedding. So France was pretty rough with its Calvinists. It didn't want them around. You can kind of see where Geneva is in relation, so no wonder Calvinism was spreading. And just to give you a little bit of background again about how a Calvinist church would be run, the church was organized into 4 offices. You had pastors, teachers to instruct the people, and then you had elders or average lay people chosen by a council. You also had deacons. They were responsible for taking care of the poor. And then again, that doctrine of predestination. So it was a pretty new hierarchy that got rid of, obviously, the Pope, but also set up a system where they were kind of in charge of everything in their area. So as you saw the map earlier, the Reformation will continue to spread. It will go to Denmark and then up into Sweden and make inroads into Poland. And so at this point, Charles V is losing his mind because he is a devoted Catholic. He wants everybody to be Catholic, and so he really goes to war against the Schmalkaldic League. And in 1547, he crushes that league. He puts puppet rulers in charge, like people he specifically chose and controls in areas like Hesse and Saxony, and he's forcing Protestants to return to Catholicism. Many Protestants will actually flee to a city called Magdeburg, which was like a Protestant refuge. But what Charles V realizes is that the Reformation has been around too long, and too many people have benefited from it by taking back Catholic land, and the princes are supporting these Lutherans. And so the puppet rulers of Saxony are going to change to become Lutheran. The emperor is just going to have to give up. So in September of 1555, and this is a very important event that you need to remember and know by heart, the Peace of Augsburg is signed. And that essentially makes the Protestant Reformation a permanent thing. Like, they're never going to become Catholic again. There's a division again in the Christian church. And so now you have 3 major sects in the Christian church. You have the Eastern Orthodox Church, which happened in the 11th century, and we already mentioned that. And then you have this division now, so between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so what this new rule does, this peace does, is it essentially allows whoever is the ruler of the region that you live in determines your religion. So the ruler of the land determines your religion. So if you live in a Lutheran area, you're Lutheran. If you live in a Catholic area, you're Catholic. So if you're a Lutheran living in a Catholic area, you should move. And if you're a Catholic living in a Lutheran area, you should move, because you could be killed or persecuted or prosecuted for your beliefs. Lutherans were permitted to retain some of the church lands that they had taken before 1552, but not any of the ones they won after. And it did not extend recognition to 2 other groups. The Anabaptists were still considered too heretical and too crazy, so they were not accepted, and neither were Calvinists. So both the Lutherans and the Catholics would persecute Calvinists. And so Calvinists will not be accepted officially until 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. The Anabaptists here, just to give you an idea, they were still a minority sect, and you can see that their centers and general distribution, many Anabaptists in the Netherlands, some over in the eastern part of the Habsburg Empire in Moravia, and then some down farther south, just kind of north of what would be modern-day Italy. But for the most part, these were small enclaves with not as many followers. Just so you know, the Netherlands during this time period was controlled by Spain. They called it the Spanish Netherlands, and as a result, this was an area where Anabaptists were often persecuted and killed because they had different beliefs than, obviously, Spain, which was Catholic. This is another thing that's important about the Anabaptists, is to understand what they believed. They did not believe in infant baptism, but they believed that baptism, that sacrament, had to happen as an adult after you knew enough to understand your faith, and then you'd make a commitment to the church. And neither the Catholics nor the Lutherans nor the Calvinists thought that that was okay. So in the late 1500s, this is what Europe looks like. You can see the Lutheran areas up near Wittenberg. You can see the Calvinist areas. You can see the Anglican areas, which we're going to talk about in just a second when we talk about the English Reformation. Anglican meaning very much like the Catholic Church, but under the control of the king and no longer under the control of the Pope. And then you see the Calvinist influenced areas, and then the Roman Catholic areas. And if you were to look, I think you would generalize and say, except for North Africa, which is not part of this, the Roman Catholic area much outweighs the rest of the smaller Protestant groups. So you'd probably say about 2/3 of Europe remained Catholic, even in the late 1500s after all of this rebellion. So now we're going to start talking about the English Reformation, and I just wanted you to see these paintings because we're getting into what's called the Baroque time period of art in the 1500s and into the late 1500s. And that art was art that the Catholic Church put out to promote itself, but that art was also used to promote the monarchy and political leaders. And they were very big pieces of artwork. They were very extravagant. And you can see here, there's a painter, his name is Hans Holbein, who is going to kind of go between this late Renaissance artwork and this Baroque time period. And Hans Holbein did the Ambassadors, which some of you did as your art project. And he painted about the discord of the Catholic Church, in that there is an actual musical instrument here and the chord is broken to represent the Catholic Church being broken. There's lots of symbols in here. But you can also just see these are two political leaders, an ambassador, and I'm trying to remember what he is, but the idea was that no longer is the church the main source of power, but you're starting to see a movement away from that to political leaders or secular leaders as being very powerful. So Henry VIII is our leader of England when the Reformation begins, when the Protestant Reformation begins. And he actually responds very negatively to the Protestant Reformation. He hates Luther. He thinks Luther's ideas are unchristian and that he should be kicked out of the Catholic Church. But Henry VIII also realizes that he doesn't like the Catholic Church telling him what to do. He doesn't like the Catholic Church taking money from his country and sending it back to Rome. He doesn't like that the Catholic Church owns land and has power in his country. And he doesn't like that the Catholic Church can tell him whether or not to marry or get a divorce or get an annulment and marry someone. So he doesn't like that somebody is over him. And that's what the English Reformation is more about than religion. Because for Henry VIII here, he doesn't care so much about the beliefs. He actually is very devoted to the Catholic faith. But what he doesn't like is the power structure that makes him have to listen to the Pope. And as a result, the Pope is very closely connected to Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and also controls a lot of the New World. And here's this new English king, and he wants some power too. And so he just so happens to marry his first wife. She is actually Charles V's aunt, and she is very Catholic. And he doesn't like that the Pope is telling him what to do regarding his marriage to his first wife. So just the only thing I think you need on this slide is that I told you already that England had some Protestantism or protesters in it, but it was advancing very slowly. It had started in the late 1300s with some people kind of writing stuff against the Catholic Church. But England, for the most part, had maintained the authority of the crown against the Pope and had tried to make it so that the king was not being told what to do by the Pope. So why did England have to have a Reformation? It's all political, and it has to do with the fact that Henry VIII needed an heir to his throne, and he needed a male heir that was legitimate. Otherwise, he was very likely going to have a civil war in his country over who would be the next king. So he had his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, did not give him a son. She had a daughter. Her name was Mary. She will become Mary the First. But he needs a son because passing the throne to a woman is not considered acceptable at this point, and he really needs a son. His father had fought the War of the Roses and had secured the throne, and he was not going to be the one who lost the throne. So in order for him to get an annulment and get rid of Catherine of Aragon, he needed the Pope to agree. The Pope didn't agree. Charles V, who was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, put pressure on the Pope not to agree. And the result was that if Henry VIII was going to get another wife and have a chance at a male heir, he was going to need to disobey the Pope. And he did. And the result was that he left the Catholic Church. So this is just the play-by-play of the Reformation Parliament and their decisions. So the Parliament would be the legislative body that Henry VIII was in charge of, and they're going to change the laws and pass some laws that make Henry VIII the head of the church in England. They will change it and name it the Anglican Church, but it will remain in its practices to be just like the Catholic Church. So you open the doors and you're like, oh, it's the Catholic Church again, but on the outside the name's changed. It's the Anglican Church and Henry VIII's in charge. So 1529, they convene a 7-year session called the Reformation Parliament. They're going to pass legislation to put the church leaders, the clergy, under the authority of the king instead of the Pope. In 1531, the king was officially made the head of the Catholic Church. So in 1532, they're going to publish official grievances against the Catholic Church. And by 1534, all payments to Rome are going to end, and Henry VIII is going to be made and put in charge of all of the appointments to the church leadership. So all the clergy, the priests, the cardinals, the bishops, and everything within England will be under the control of the King of England. So that same year in 1534, you'll have what's called the Act of Supremacy, which declares Henry the only supreme head of the Church of England. And they use the term Anglican Church, Anglican, Anglican Church. It is pretty much Catholic. It'll change over time and become at points more Calvinist and at other points Puritan, but it's the Church of England. And so it's whatever the leadership of the government decides is the main teachings of that church is what they will teach. For the most part, again, it'll remain Catholic in what it's like inside the church, but the king will be in charge. Now there's a video here. I'm not going to show it to you, but I'll put it as a link. It's the Henry video where he had so many wives. It's amazing in that it is the most annoying video I've ever seen. It's like a 6-minute music video. It's hysterical. It'll help you to remember. But it's like It's a Small World, if you've ever heard that song. Once it gets into your head, I don't know if it'll get out of your head. So I'll put it on separately so you can listen to it if you'd like to be tortured. One of my favorite stories about King Henry and his many, many wives, the 6 in total, is that he had Hans Holbein, who is a well-known painter that we've talked about before, that did the 2 paintings at the beginning. He had Hans Holbein go out and do a painting of 2 potential brides because he wanted to decide which one to marry. And so he went and got a painting done, Hans Holbein did, of Christina of Denmark. She's on the left-hand side. And then he got this other painting of, her name was Anne of Cleves, and she was from Germany. So these were kind of his 2 choices. Obviously, he's got to pick women that are not from a Catholic area. So he's got these 2 choices. Hans Holbein sends him essentially these little portraits, and he goes, oh, I picked the one on the right. She's amazing. She's beautiful. And then she showed up. He was already ready to marry her. He gets her there. He lifts the veil, and he says, I like her not. And he calls her the Flanders mare, M-A-R-E, like a horse. And he said she had a horse face. And then he brought Hans Holbein up, and he said, I'm going to kill you because you just made me marry this ugly one. And so what Hans Holbein said in his defense that kept him alive was, he said, well, I thought you would understand that Christina was beautiful naturally, and so I didn't actually adorn her with much of anything because she was so beautiful naturally. And Anne of Cleves was so ugly that I put so many jewels and everything on her. And he said, pretty much, Henry VIII said, if you ever do this again, I will kill you. He immediately divorced Anne of Cleves, and she stayed at his house in his palace, but he called her his sister and never touched her. So that was my little story, but just so you know, his wife before that, his third wife, did have a son. His name would be Edward VI, and he will take the throne when he is 10 years old, and he will rule and enact several reforms, but really they were under regencies because he wasn't old enough. So there were other people helping him to rule. But in 1553, he's going to die, and he leaves his sister, Mary I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, who was very Catholic. She becomes queen, and she's going to quickly send England back to the Catholic Church, and they call her Bloody Mary because she had about 300 Protestants in England, or what we would call Anglicans, killed. So that's kind of the Protestant Reformation in review, and then the English Reformation. So this idea of changing this church in England to secure the throne and end up at the very end of England having a woman have to take over anyway, because Edward VI died pretty young. I think he was 16 when he died. So he didn't rule for very long. And all of these changes that were made to the Catholic Church and how they got rid of it, and they made the changes in the Church of England, would end up right back in the Catholic Church's hands when Mary I becomes the Queen of England. And again, she was the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And she will actually marry Philip II, who is the King of Spain. And so at this point, Mary and Philip will rule England together. And so essentially you have a combined monarchy of England and Spain, all very Catholic.